Mara Whitlock stood in the doorway of her cabin, rifle trembling in her frostbitten hands, staring at the half-dead stranger sprawled across her porch. Behind her, 5 terrified children huddled in silence. Outside, the worst blizzard in 20 years screamed through the mountains. She had 2 choices: drag him inside and risk everything, or leave him to freeze and live with that choice forever. But when her youngest daughter's breath began to rattle like death itself, and the stranger's fever-bright eyes opened with knowledge that shouldn't exist in a dying man, Mara realized she'd already made a decision that would change everything. If you're watching from somewhere in this world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see just how far this story travels. And if it grabs hold of you, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't believe where this goes. The wind came down from the high peaks like a living thing with teeth, tearing through the valley with a sound that made even the stones seem to shudder. Mara Whitlock had lived through 18 Montana winters, but she'd never heard anything quite like this. A howl that seemed to carry voices in it, warnings from the mountains themselves that something had shifted, that the world had turned savage in ways it hadn't been before. She stood at the window of the cabin, one hand pressed against the frost-thick glass, watching the snow come down in sheets so dense she couldn't see the barn 50 yards away. Behind her, the children were silent. That was the part that frightened her most. 5 children, and not one of them making a sound. "Mama," Thomas said quietly. He was 13, tall for his age and too serious, with his father's dark hair and a jaw that had started to square off in the last year. "We should bring the horses in closer." "Can't," Mara said. Her voice was steady, but only because she'd learned how to make it that way. "Storm's too fierce. They're safer in the barn than out in this." "But if the barn roof, then we'll deal with it when the storm breaks." She turned from the window and looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the weight he was carrying. The weight of trying to be the man of the house when he was still just a boy. "Thomas, we're going to be fine." He didn't look convinced, but he nodded anyway and went back to the corner where he'd been checking their stores, counting the grain bags, the preserved vegetables, the salted meat hanging from the rafters, making lists in his head of what would last and what wouldn't. Mara's chest tightened. He shouldn't have to think that way. None of them should. Beside the fire, 10-year-old Esther sat with the mending, her needle moving with the kind of precision that came from too much practice. She was small for her age, quiet in the way that worried Mara sometimes. Not shy, but watchful, as if she were always waiting for the next bad thing to happen and wanted to see it coming. Across from her, the twins, Jacob and Joshua, 8 years old and identical down to the cowlick at their left temples, were playing with carved wooden horses their father had made 3 years ago, before the fever took him. They played without speaking, moving the horses through invisible landscapes only they could see. And in the rocking chair nearest the fire, wrapped in every blanket they owned, was Alice. 6 years old, blonde curls that hadn't been brushed in 2 days because every time Mara tried, Alice coughed so hard she couldn't breathe. Her face was flushed, her breathing shallow and quick, and when Mara had checked her forehead an hour ago, the heat coming off her skin had been terrifying. "Mama!" Esther's voice was barely a whisper. "Alice is shaking." Mara crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the rocking chair. Alice's eyes were half open, unfocused, and her whole body trembled beneath the blankets. Mara pressed her palm to Alice's forehead and felt the fever burning hotter than before. "It's all right, sweet girl," Mara murmured, though her heart was hammering. "You're all right." But Alice wasn't all right. The cough that had started 2 days ago as something minor had turned into something else, something deep in her chest that rattled when she breathed. Mara had tried everything she knew: steam from boiled water, a poultice of mustard and flour on her chest, willow bark tea to bring the fever down, but nothing was working. Alice was getting worse, and the nearest doctor was in town, 15 miles away through a storm that would kill anyone fool enough to try riding through it. Thomas appeared at her elbow. "I could go." "No." "Mama, I could—" "No!" Mara stood and gripped his shoulder, maybe harder than she meant to. "I won't lose you too." His face went tight, and she saw the flash of hurt in his eyes before he shoved it down and turned away. She wanted to call him back to explain that it wasn't about whether he was capable. It was about the fact that she'd already buried one person she loved, and she couldn't do it again. but the words stuck in her throat, and Thomas was already halfway across the room, his back rigid with all the feelings he wouldn't let himself show. Mara closed her eyes and took a breath, then another. Then she opened them and went back to Alice, adjusting the blankets, brushing the damp curls away from her face, whispering things she didn't believe but needed to say anyway. The wind screamed, the fire crackled, Alice's breath came in short, shallow gasps. And then through the storm came a sound that didn't belong. Mara's head snapped up. For a moment she thought she'd imagined it, but no, there it was again. A thudding sound, heavy and rhythmic, like something being dragged across the porch. Thomas was already moving toward the rifle above the door. "Wait," Mara said. She held up a hand, listening. The sound came again. 3 deliberate thuds, then silence. "Someone's out there," Thomas said. "Or something," Jacob whispered. Joshua elbowed him, but his eyes were wide. Mara crossed to the door and lifted the rifle down herself. It was her husband's rifle, a Henry repeater he'd bought the year before he died, and it still felt too big in her hands. But she knew how to use it. She'd made sure of that. "Esther, take Alice into the back room," Mara said quietly. "Thomas, stay with them. Jacob, Joshua, behind the table." "Mama?" Thomas started. "Now." They moved. Mara waited until she heard the back door close, until she knew the children were as safe as they could be, and then she lifted the latch and pulled the door open 6 inches. The cold hit her like a fist. Snow blasted through the gap, and for a moment she couldn't see anything but white. Then the wind shifted, and she saw it. A horse. Riderless, its reins tangled in something dark that lay sprawled across the top step of the porch. The horse's head was down, its flanks heaving, and frost clung to its mane in thick clumps. It looked like it had been running for miles. And the dark shape on the porch. Mara's breath caught. It was a man. Face down, one arm twisted beneath him, blood streaked across the snow around him in a pattern that made her stomach turn. For a long moment she didn't move. Every instinct she had screamed at her to shut the door, to bar it, to pretend she'd seen nothing. Strangers were dangerous. Strangers brought trouble, and a stranger who showed up bleeding in the middle of a blizzard was trouble she couldn't afford. But then the man moved, just barely, a twitch of his fingers, a shallow rise and fall of his back. He was alive. Mara's hands tightened on the rifle. She thought about her children huddled in the back room. She thought about Alice burning up with fever. She thought about all the ways this could go wrong. And then she thought about what kind of person she wanted to be. She stepped out onto the porch. The cold was brutal, stealing the air from her lungs. She kept the rifle raised as she moved closer, her boots crunching through snow that was already ankle deep. The man didn't move again. Up close, she could see that his coat was torn, that the blood wasn't just on the snow but soaked into his clothes, that his skin had the grayish tint of someone who'd been out in the cold too long. "Mister," she said. Her voice came out harder than she felt. "Can you hear me?" No response. She nudged him with her boot. Not gently, but not cruel either. Still nothing. The horse shifted, its eyes rolling white, and Mara realized the reins weren't just tangled. They were wrapped around the man's wrist, as if he'd tied himself to the saddle to keep from falling off, and then done exactly that anyway. Mara looked at the storm, looked at the man, looked back at the cabin door where she knew Thomas was probably watching through the gap, rifle in his own hands now. This was a mistake. She knew it was a mistake. She slung her rifle over her shoulder, grabbed the man under his arms, and dragged him inside. He was heavier than he looked, dead weight, her mind supplied unhelpfully, though she shoved the thought away. She got him through the door and onto the floor near the fire, then slammed the door shut and threw the bar across it. Snow swirled across the floorboards, already melting into dark puddles. "Mama?" Thomas's voice, tight with fear. "It's all right," Mara said, though it wasn't. She knelt beside the man and pressed her fingers to his throat, searching for a pulse. For a horrible moment, she felt nothing, and then, faint and irregular, there it was. "He's alive." "Barely." Thomas appeared at her side, the rifle still in his hands. "Who is he?" "I don't know." Why'd you bring him in?" "Because I'm not the kind of woman who lets a man freeze to death on her porch." She said it more sharply than she meant to, and Thomas flinched. Mara closed her eyes for a second, then opened them and made her voice gentler. Help me get his coat off. We need to see where he's hurt. For a moment, she thought Thomas might argue. But then he set the rifle aside and knelt down across from her, and together they started working at the buttons of the man's coat. It was thick wool, good quality, but stiff with ice and blood. Underneath, his shirt was worse, torn open across the ribs, the fabric stained dark. Mara peeled it back and sucked in a breath. 3 long gashes across his side, deep enough that she could see muscle. They looked like they'd been made by claws, or a knife dragged deliberately slow. Around them, bruises spread like storm clouds, purple and black. Jesus, Thomas whispered. Get me water, Mara said. Hot as you can stand, and clean rags. Tear up one of the old shirts if you have to. Thomas hesitated, staring at the wounds. Now, Thomas. He moved. Mara turned her attention back to the man. His face was half hidden by dark hair matted with snow and blood, but she could see enough to know he wasn't young, maybe 30, maybe older. There was a scar along his jawline, old and pale, and his hands were calloused in the way that spoke of hard work. Not a drifter, then, or at least not one who'd always been drifting. She pressed a clean section of his shirt against the worst of the wounds, trying to slow the bleeding, and his eyes snapped open. Mara jerked back, one hand going for the rifle, but he didn't move. Just stared at her with eyes that were gray, or maybe green, or maybe some color that didn't have a name. Fever bright and unfocused, like he was seeing something that wasn't there. You're safe, Mara said, though she didn't know if that was true. You're inside. You're going to be all right. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then his eyes rolled back, and he went limp again. Thomas returned with a basin of steaming water and an armful of rags. Esther slipped in behind him, her face pale but determined. I can help, Esther said. Mara wanted to send her away, to keep her from seeing this, but the truth was she needed the help. All right, but if I tell you to step back, you step back, understood? Esther nodded. They worked in silence, cleaning the wounds as best they could. The hot water made the blood flow faster at first, and Mara had to pack the gashes with cloth to keep him from bleeding out on her floor. She'd stitched up animals before, a horse with a torn flank, a cow that got caught on barbed wire, but never a person. Her hands shook as she threaded the needle. Mama, Thomas said quietly, you sure about this? No, Mara said, but I'm doing it anyway. The first stitch went in, and the man didn't even flinch. That was almost worse than if he'd screamed. It meant he was too far gone to feel it, or too close to dying to care. Mara kept going. One stitch, then another, then another. Her stitches weren't pretty. They'd scar badly, but they'd hold. They had to. By the time she finished, her hands were cramping, and the basin of water had turned dark red. The man's breathing was still shallow, still uneven, but the bleeding had slowed. That was something. We need to keep him warm, Mara said. Esther, get the spare blankets from the chest. Thomas, stoke the fire. They moved to obey, and Mara sat back on her heels, looking at the stranger she'd just saved, or tried to save. It was still too early to know if he'd make it through the night. From the back room, Alice started to cough, deep, rattling coughs that seemed to go on forever. Mara's head snapped around, and she saw Thomas's face go white. Go, Thomas said. I'll watch him. Mara didn't argue. She pushed to her feet and hurried to the back room where Alice was sitting up in bed, her whole body convulsing with each cough. Mara gathered her up, holding her close, rubbing her back, murmuring nonsense words that were supposed to be comforting. But Alice couldn't catch her breath. The coughs kept coming, harder and harder, and her lips were starting to turn blue. Panic clawed at Mara's throat. She tilted Alice's head back, trying to clear her airway, but it wasn't working. Alice's eyes were wide and terrified, her small hands clutching at Mara's arms. And Mara felt the world start to narrow down to this one moment, this one child, this one unbearable possibility. Move. The voice came from behind her, rough and low. Mara spun, still holding Alice, and saw the stranger standing in the doorway. He was swaying on his feet, one hand pressed to his bandaged side, his face gray with pain, but his eyes were clear, focused. I said move, he repeated. Mara's first instinct was to tell him to get back, to stay away from her daughter, but Alice was choking, and she was out of options. She stepped aside. The stranger crossed the room in 3 unsteady steps and knelt beside the bed. Lay her flat, he said. On her side. Mara did, her hands shaking. Alice's coughs were weaker now, more desperate, and the blue tinge around her mouth was spreading. The stranger put one hand on Alice's back between her shoulder blades and the other on her chest. Then he pressed, firm, rhythmic, nothing like Mara had seen before. Once, twice, 3 times. Alice gasped, a horrible, wet sound, but air. She was getting air. There, the stranger murmured. He shifted his hands, tilted her head slightly, pressed again. Come on, little one, breathe. And Alice did. The coughs eased, and her breathing evened out, and the color started to come back into her face. She sagged against the pillow, exhausted, and closed her eyes. Mara stared at the stranger. How did you? Steam, he said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in a long time. You need steam. Boil water, make a tent over her head with a blanket. Let her breathe it in. It'll loosen what's in her chest. I tried that, Mara said. Not enough. She needs it constant. All night if you have to. He swayed, and Mara reached out instinctively to steady him. His skin was burning hot beneath her hand. And willow bark tea won't do it. You need something stronger. Horehound, if you have it. Or colt's foot. Mara did have horehound, a bundle of it hanging in the kitchen, left over from last winter. Who are you? The stranger looked at her, and for a moment she saw something in his eyes that might have been humor, or maybe just exhaustion. Someone who's going to pass out in about 10 seconds if you don't let me sit down. He wasn't exaggerating. Mara got him into a chair just before his legs gave out, and he slumped forward with his head in his hands, breathing hard. Blood was starting to seep through the bandages at his side. Thomas, Mara called, I need the horehound from the kitchen and more hot water. Esther, help me get the blankets arranged. They worked through the night. Mara set up the steam tent over Alice's bed, boiling pot after pot of water and letting the vapor fill the small space beneath the blanket. Every 20 minutes, she lifted the edge to check on Alice, to make sure she was still breathing, still fighting. And slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, Alice started to improve. The rattle in her chest eased. Her breathing deepened. The terrible blue tinge faded. The stranger, Mara still didn't know his name, drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever climbing and falling in waves. When he was lucid, he gave her instructions in that rough, quiet voice. How to brew the horehound tea, how often to give it to Alice, how to position her so the steam worked best. When the fever took him, he muttered things that didn't make sense. Names, places, fragments of sentences that sounded like arguments or apologies. Thomas watched him with suspicion that bordered on hostility. He'd moved the rifle closer to where he sat, and his hand never strayed far from it. We don't know anything about him, Thomas said, low enough that only Mara could hear. He could be dangerous. He saved Alice, Mara said. Maybe. Or maybe he just knew what to say to get us to trust him. Mara looked at her son, this boy trying so hard to be a man, and saw the fear beneath the anger. You don't have to trust him, she said gently, but I need you to trust me. Thomas's jaw worked. Then he nodded, stiff and reluctant, and went back to his vigil. By the time dawn started to gray the windows, Alice was sleeping peacefully for the first time in 2 days. Her forehead was cool to the touch, her breathing deep and even. The fever had broken. Mara sat beside her bed, her own eyes burning with exhaustion, and let herself cry. Just for a minute. Just enough to let the terror of the last 12 hours bleed out of her. When she came back out to the main room, the stranger was awake. He was sitting up, his back against the wall, one hand still pressed to his bandaged side. He looked worse in the morning light, older, more worn down, the kind of tired that went bone deep. She all right? He asked. Mara nodded. Thanks to you. He shrugged, winced, and stopped moving. Good. You should rest, Mara said. You lost a lot of blood. I'll rest when I'm gone. Gone? Mara frowned. You can't ride in your condition. You'd be dead before you made it a mile. Then I'll die off your land instead of on it. He met her eyes, and there was something hard in his gaze. I know how this works. You help me because you're a decent person, but you don't want me here, and I don't blame you. Mara opened her mouth to argue, but the truth was part of her did want him gone. He was a stranger, and strangers brought complications. But another part of her, the part that had spent the night watching him fight through fever to help her daughter, thought maybe he'd earned more than being thrown out into the snow. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated. Then, Gideon Hale. "I'm Mara Whitlock, and you're not going anywhere until you can stand up without bleeding through your bandages." "Mrs. Whitlock, it's not a discussion." Mara folded her arms. "You saved my daughter's life. The least I can do is make sure you don't die in the next 24 hours. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. 24 hours. Then I'm gone." "We'll see," Mara said. She turned to find Thomas standing in the doorway to the back room, his expression unreadable. He'd heard everything, and from the set of his shoulders, he didn't like it one bit. But he didn't argue. He just picked up the rifle, crossed to the far corner of the room, and sat down with it across his lap, watching, waiting. Mara sighed and went to make coffee. It was going to be a long day. The storm blew itself out by mid-morning, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of fresh snow that glittered viciously in the sunlight. Mara sent the twins out to check on the barn and the animals, and they came back reporting that the roof had held and the horses were fine, just hungry and restless from being cooped up. Gideon slept through most of the day, his breathing ragged but steady. Mara changed his bandages once and was relieved to see that the wounds were starting to close. No signs of infection yet. She'd seen men die from less, and she knew he wasn't out of danger, but he was a fighter. She could see that much. By evening, Alice was awake and asking for soup. Mara nearly cried again from sheer relief. She made venison stew, thick and rich, and watched Alice eat a whole bowl without coughing once. "Mama," Alice said, her voice still hoarse. "Who's the man?" "Someone who needed help," Mara said carefully. "Is he staying?" "For a little while." Alice considered this, her blue eyes serious. "He has sad eyes." Mara glanced over at Gideon still sleeping against the wall. Alice was right. Even unconscious, there was something heavy about him, something that spoke of old wounds that had nothing to do with the gashes in his side. "Maybe he does," Mara said. "But that's not our business, sweet girl. We're just going to help him get well, and then he'll be on his way." Alice nodded and went back to her soup, but Mara could tell she was still thinking about it. That night, after the children were in bed, Mara sat by the fire with her mending and tried not to watch Gideon too obviously. He'd woken an hour ago and accepted a bowl of stew without comment, eating slowly and carefully like every movement hurt, which it probably did. "You know medicine," Mara said. It wasn't a question. Gideon looked up from his bowl. "Some. More than some. What you did for Alice, that wasn't something you just picked up." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I was a field surgeon during the war." Mara's hands stilled on the fabric she was mending. The war had ended more than a decade ago, but its shadows still lingered. Every town had men who'd come back different, or who hadn't come back at all. Her own husband had fought, though he'd never talked about it much. "Which side?" she asked. "Does it matter?" "Maybe. Maybe not." Mara set her mending aside. "What are you running from, Mr. Hale?" "What makes you think I'm running?" "Because a man doesn't show up half dead in a blizzard unless he's running from something, or someone." Gideon's jaw tightened. For a moment, Mara thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he set the bowl aside and leaned his head back against the wall, his eyes on the ceiling. "I'm running from what I was accused of," he said quietly. "Not what I did. There's a difference." "What were you accused of?" "Cowardice? Desertion?" The words came out flat, emotionless. "They said I abandoned my post during a battle. Let men die because I was too afraid to stay." Mara studied him. "And did you?" His eyes cut to hers, sharp as broken glass. "No." She believed him. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the way he'd fought through his own fever to save Alice, or maybe it was just instinct, but she believed him. "So why are they still hunting you?" "Because the truth doesn't matter when the people in power want you gone." Gideon's voice was bitter now. "I saw things I wasn't supposed to see. Knew things I wasn't supposed to know. And when I tried to speak up, they made sure I'd never be heard." "What kind of things?" But Gideon shook his head. "You don't want to know. And I don't want to put that weight on you." Mara wanted to argue, but she could see the exhaustion in every line of his face. Whatever he was carrying, it was heavy enough to break a man. "All right," she said. "But Mr. Hale, if you're going to be under my roof, I need to know you're not going to bring trouble down on my family." "I won't," Gideon said. 24 hours, remember? I'll be gone before anyone knows I was here." But even as he said it, Mara could see the doubt in his eyes, could see that he didn't believe it any more than she did. She went to bed that night with a knot of unease in her stomach, and when she woke in the cold dark of pre-dawn to the sound of Thomas shouting, she knew that trouble had already found them. She grabbed her robe and ran into the main room to find Thomas standing over Gideon, the rifle pointed at his chest. Gideon was awake, his hands raised, his face carefully blank. "Thomas!" Mara's voice cracked like a whip. "What are you doing?" "Ask him," Thomas said. His voice was shaking, but the rifle didn't waver. "Ask him what I found in his coat." Mara looked at Gideon. "What's he talking about?" "I can explain," Gideon started, but Thomas cut him off. "He's wanted," Thomas said. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and threw it on the floor between them. "There's a bounty on him. $500 for information leading to his capture. He's a deserter and a coward, and we just let him into our house." Mara picked up the paper with shaking hands. It was a wanted poster, creased and water-stained, but the words were still clear, and there, beneath the description of the crimes, was a sketch of a man's face. Gideon Hale. She looked up at him and saw confirmation in his eyes. "I told you I was running from what I was accused of," Gideon said quietly. "I didn't lie." "But you didn't tell the whole truth either." Mara's voice was colder than she meant it to be, but fear was making her sharp. $500. That's enough to keep this homestead running for 2 years. "I know. And you thought you could just walk away in 24 hours and we'd never know?" "I hoped." Gideon's eyes never left hers. "I saved your daughter, Mrs. Whitlock. Doesn't that count for something?" "It does," Mara said, "which is why I'm not letting my son shoot you where you sit. But Mr. Hale, you need to understand that I have 5 children depending on me. 5 children, and winter's barely started. If turning you in means they eat this year, then I'll do what I have to do." The silence that followed was suffocating. Thomas still had the rifle trained on Gideon. Gideon still had his hands raised, and Mara stood between them, her heart hammering, knowing that whatever she decided in the next few seconds would change everything. "Mama," Thomas said, "we should send for the marshal." "The marshal's in town," Mara said. 15 miles away through snow we can barely walk through, let alone ride." "Then we hold him until we can." Mara looked at Gideon, looked at the bandages around his ribs, the exhaustion in his face, the way he held himself like a man who'd already lost everything that mattered and was just waiting for the final blow. She thought about the way he'd saved Alice, the way he'd fought through his own agony to make sure her daughter could breathe. She thought about what kind of person she wanted to be. "No," Mara said. Thomas's head snapped toward her. "Mama, put the rifle down, Thomas." "Are you crazy? I said put it down." Mara's voice was steel. "Now." For a long, terrible moment, Thomas didn't move. Then, slowly, he lowered the rifle. But the look he gave her was full of betrayal and fury, and it cut deeper than any words could have. Mara turned to Gideon. "You have until morning to tell me the truth. All of it. And then we'll decide what happens next." Gideon studied her face. Then finally, he nodded and lowered his hands. Thomas made a sound of disgust and stalked out of the room, slamming the door to the back behind him hard enough to wake the whole house. And Mara, standing in the firelight with a wanted man bleeding quietly in her cabin and her son's trust in ruins, wondered if she'd just made the worst mistake of her life. The fire had burned down to embers by the time Gideon started talking, and Mara had wrapped herself in a quilt to ward off the cold that crept through the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had picked up again, not as fierce as the blizzard, but persistent, rattling the shutters like something trying to get in. The children were asleep, or pretending to be. Mara could feel Thomas's anger radiating from the back room like heat from a stove. Gideon sat with his back against the wall, one hand pressed to his bandaged ribs, his eyes fixed on the dying fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet Mara had to lean forward to hear him. "There was a camp," he said, "outside Chattanooga. Winter of '63. We'd been there for 3 weeks, waiting for orders that never came. Supplies were running low. Men were sick, starving, freezing, and the officers, He stopped, his jaw working. The officers were selling the supplies that were meant for the soldiers. Medicine, food, blankets, selling them to civilians for profit while men died in their tents. Mara's hands tightened on the quilt. She'd heard stories like this before, whispered in town by men who'd come back from the war with hollowed-out eyes and voices that shook when they talked about what they'd seen. But hearing it directly was different. I was the surgeon, Gideon continued. I saw everything, watched men die from infections that could have been prevented if we'd had the medicine that was supposed to be there. Watched them waste away from hunger while officers ate like kings. And when I went to the colonel, when I told him what was happening, he told me to keep my mouth shut or I'd regret it. But you didn't, Mara said. Gideon's laugh was bitter. No, I didn't. I wrote to headquarters. Documented everything. Names, dates, amounts. I thought if I could just get it in front of someone who cared, someone who'd actually do something about it. He shook his head. I was naive. The men I reported were connected, powerful. They had friends in places I didn't even know existed, and when my letter reached the wrong desk, they decided I was the problem. So they accused you of desertion. Not at first. At first they just tried to discredit me, said I was unstable, unreliable, but I had proof, and they knew it. So during the next battle, his voice went flat, emotionless. During the next battle, they sent me to a position they knew would be overrun, told me to hold it with a skeleton crew, and when we got slaughtered, they blamed me for abandoning my post. Mara felt something cold settle in her stomach. But you didn't abandon it. I stayed until there was no one left to save. Gideon's eyes were distant now, seeing something she couldn't. When the retreat came, I carried 3 wounded men through enemy fire, lost 2 of them before we made it back to camp. The third died in my arms while I was stitching him up, and the next morning I was arrested for cowardice and desertion. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the soft crackle of the embers. Mara tried to imagine it, tried to picture this man, younger and less worn, fighting to save lives while the people who were supposed to lead him plotted his destruction. It made her chest ache. How did you get away? She asked. A friend helped me escape before the court-martial, got me out of camp in the middle of the night, gave me a horse and enough supplies to make it to the border. I've been running ever since. How long? 12 years. The weight of those years sat heavy in his voice. 12 years of moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to be found. Taking work where I could find it, using different names, always looking over my shoulder. And just when I thought maybe I'd gotten far enough, maybe I'd finally found a place where no one would look. He gestured to the wanted poster still lying on the floor. Someone recognized me. I barely got out alive. Mara looked at the gashes across his ribs. Is that how you got hurt? Bounty hunters. 3 of them, 2 days ago. Cornered me in a ravine about 30 miles north of here. I killed one, wounded another, and ran. The third one chased me halfway through the mountains before the storm hit, and I lost him. Gideon's hand went to his side, and Mara saw him wince. Thought I was going to die out there. Then your cabin showed up like something out of a fever dream. And now you're trapped here, Mara said quietly. With people who could turn you in for money we desperately need. Gideon met her eyes. I know what I'm asking you to do. I know what it costs. If you decide to send for the marshal, I won't fight it. I'm tired, Mrs. Whitlock. Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of living like every day might be my last. Maybe it's time to stop. There was something in his voice that frightened her. Not anger or desperation, but resignation. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying a burden too long, and the quiet relief of finally being ready to put it down. Don't talk like that, Mara said, more sharply than she intended. You saved my daughter's life. I'm not going to repay that by handing you over to people who'll hang you for crimes you didn't commit. Then what are you going to do? It was a fair question, and Mara didn't have an answer. She sat there, wrapped in her quilt, staring at a man who'd been branded a coward for trying to do the right thing, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like snow piling up on a roof. I don't know yet, she admitted, but I'll figure something out. Gideon studied her face for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. Thank you. Mara stood, gathering the quilt around her. Get some rest, Mr. Hale. Morning's going to come too soon, and we've got a lot to sort out. Voss, she was halfway to her room when his voice stopped her. Mrs. Whitlock? She turned back. Your son, Gideon said. He's scared. Not of me. Of losing you. Of not being able to protect his family. That's why he's so angry. Mara's throat tightened. I know. Talk to him. Before this gets worse. She wanted to say that Thomas wouldn't listen, that he'd shut her out the way he'd been shutting her out for months. But Gideon was right. She had to try. I will, she said, and meant it. Morning came gray and cold, the sun hidden behind clouds that promised more snow. Mara woke to find Alice curled against her side, warm and breathing easy, her fever completely gone. For a moment, Mara just lay there, listening to her daughter's steady breath, letting the gratitude wash over her. Alice was alive. Whatever else happened, at least she had that. She eased out of bed without waking Alice and went to the main room. Gideon was already awake, sitting in the same position she'd left him in, staring at nothing. The bandages around his ribs had seeped blood overnight, and his face was pale with exhaustion. You should have woken me, Mara said. Those need changing. Didn't want to disturb you. Well, you're disturbing me now by bleeding all over my floor. She fetched clean bandages and hot water and set to work unwrapping the old dressings. The wounds looked better than she'd expected. No infection, edges starting to knit together. Whatever else Gideon was, he healed fast. He didn't flinch as she cleaned and rebandaged him, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself perfectly still to keep from showing pain. You should have been a doctor, Mara said as she worked. A real one, I mean, not just a field surgeon. I wanted to be. Gideon's voice was distant. Before the war. Had plans to go to medical school in Philadelphia, study with the best. But then the fighting started, and everything changed. You could still do it. After all this is over. After all this is over, I'll either be dead or in prison. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was talking about the weather. Not much room for medical school in either of those scenarios. Mara tied off the last bandage with more force than necessary. Stop talking like you've already lost. I lost 12 years ago, Mrs. Whitlock. I'm just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. She wanted to argue with him, to shake some hope back into him, but before she could, the door to the back room opened and Thomas emerged. He looked like he hadn't slept at all, his eyes red-rimmed and shadowed, his jaw set in a hard line. Morning? Mara said carefully. Thomas didn't answer. He crossed to the kitchen area, poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made earlier, and stood with his back to both of them, staring out the window. Mara exchanged a glance with Gideon, who gave a slight shake of his head. Not now, his expression said. Give him time. But time was something they might not have. The twins came out next, tumbling over each other like puppies, and the cabin filled with the noise of morning, dishes clattering, the fire being stoked, voices calling for breakfast. Esther appeared with Alice, who looked better than she had in days, her cheeks pink and her eyes bright. She climbed into Mara's lap and buried her face in her mother's shoulder, and Mara held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. Hungry, sweet girl? Mara asked. Alice nodded. They ate in near silence. Mara made cornmeal mush with the last of the maple syrup, and the children cleaned their bowls without complaint. Thomas ate standing up, still staring out the window, and didn't look at Gideon once. After breakfast, Mara sent the twins out to clear snow from the path to the barn and told Esther to keep Alice inside and warm. Then she turned to Thomas. I need to talk to you, she said quietly. Outside. For a moment she thought he'd refuse, but then he set his cup down and followed her out onto the porch, closing the door behind them. The cold hit like a slap. Snow lay thick and pristine across the valley, glittering in the weak sunlight that filtered through the clouds. It would have been beautiful if Mara hadn't been so aware of how much work it represented, paths to clear, animals to tend, firewood to split. Thomas stood with his arms crossed, his breath misting in the air, waiting. I know you're angry, Mara started. Do you? Thomas's voice was sharp. Because it doesn't seem like it. It seems like you're more worried about protecting a stranger than about protecting your own family. That's not fair. Isn't it? Mama, he's wanted. There's a price on his head. And instead of doing the smart thing, the safe thing, you're letting him stay here like some kind of guest. He saved Alice's life. Maybe. Or maybe he just got lucky. Maybe he knew enough medicine to make it look like he saved her, so we'd trust him. Mara felt her temper flare. You think I'm that stupid? You think I can't tell the difference between someone who's genuine and someone who's playing me? I think you want to see the good in people, Thomas shot back, even when it's not there, even when seeing it puts us in danger. And I think you're so scared of being hurt again that you won't let yourself trust anyone. The words came out harsher than Mara intended, and she saw Thomas flinch. She took a breath, forced herself to speak more gently. Thomas, I know you're trying to protect us. I know you think it's your job now that your father's gone, but you're 13 years old. You shouldn't have to carry that weight. Someone has to. I'm carrying it. I've been carrying it for 2 years. Then let me help. Thomas's voice cracked, and suddenly he looked younger, more vulnerable. Let me do something. I'm not a kid anymore, Mama. I'm strong enough to work, smart enough to make decisions, but you won't let me. You treat me like I'm still Jacob and Joshua's age, like I don't understand anything. Mara's heart broke a little. That's not what I'm doing. Then what are you doing? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're risking everything we have for a man who's going to leave the second he's well enough to ride. And when he does, when he brings bounty hunters or marshals or whoever else is looking for him, we're going to be the ones who pay for it. He wasn't wrong. Mara knew he wasn't wrong. Every word he'd said was a risk she'd weighed and chosen to take anyway. And she couldn't explain why except to say that something in her recognized something in Gideon, a kind of fundamental decency that had been buried under years of pain but hadn't been destroyed. Not yet. I can't turn him in, Mara said quietly. I won't. What they did to him, what they're still doing to him, it's wrong. And if I hand him over knowing that, knowing he's innocent, then I'm just as bad as the people who destroyed his life in the first place. Thomas stared at her. So we just let him stay? Let him put us all in danger? For now, yes. Until I can figure out something better. And what if there isn't anything better? What if this is it, him or us? Mara met her son's eyes and saw the fear there, raw and real. She wanted to promise him that everything would be all right, that she had a plan, that she knew what she was doing, but she'd never lied to her children and she wasn't going to start now. Then I'll make the hard choice, she said, but we're not there yet. Thomas looked away, his jaw working. When he spoke again, his voice was thick. I don't want to lose you, Mama. I don't want to lose anyone else. You won't, Mara said, and pulled him into a hug. He resisted for a second, then sagged against her, and she felt him shaking. You won't, Thomas. I promise. It was a promise she had no right to make, but she made it anyway, and held her son until he stopped shaking and pulled away, wiping his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. I still don't trust him, Thomas said. You don't have to, but can you at least give him a chance? Thomas looked at the cabin, at the smoke rising from the chimney, at the world of snow and silence that surrounded them. Finally, grudgingly, he nodded. Thank you, Mara said. They went back inside together, and Mara felt the first tiny easing of the tension that had been strangling the cabin since dawn. It wasn't much. Thomas still wouldn't look at Gideon, still kept the rifle close. But it was something. The day passed in the slow, deliberate rhythm of winter work. Mara and the twins spent hours shoveling paths, hauling water from the pump, checking on the livestock. Esther helped with the cooking and laundry, her quiet competence a blessing. Alice stayed by the fire, still weak but improving with every hour that passed. And Gideon, despite Mara's protests, insisted on making himself useful. He couldn't do heavy work, but he could mend harness leather, sharpen knives, repair the broken latch on the back door, small things that had been piling up since David died, and Mara had run out of time and energy to fix them. Thomas watched him work with narrow-eyed suspicion, but even he couldn't find fault with the quality of Gideon's repairs. By evening, the cabin felt almost normal again. Almost. There was still an undercurrent of tension, a sense that they were all waiting for something to happen, but at least they could function. After dinner, while Mara cleaned up and the children played a quiet game of checkers, Gideon sat by the fire with a piece of leather he was tooling into a new hinge for the barn door. His hands moved with practiced precision, and Mara found herself watching him, wondering about the life he'd had before the war, before everything fell apart. You're good at that, she said. Gideon glanced up. Learned it from my father. He was a saddler. Was? Died when I was 16. Fever took him and my mother both, same winter. He went back to the leather, his expression unreadable. That's when I decided to become a doctor. Thought if I'd known more, maybe I could have saved them. Mara sat down across from him. You can't save everyone. I know, but you can try. There was something in his voice that made her chest ache. This was a man who'd spent his whole life trying to save people, and the world had punished him for it. Mr. Hale, she said carefully, what you did, reporting those officers, that took courage. Or stupidity. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. No, it was courage, and you shouldn't have had to pay for it the way you did. Gideon's hand stilled on the leather. When he looked up, his eyes were bleak. The world doesn't care what's fair, Mrs. Whitlock. It cares about who has power and who doesn't. I didn't have power, so I lost. You're still here, Mara pointed out. That counts for something. Does it? He set the leather aside. I'm not sure anymore. Sometimes I think it would have been easier if I'd just died in that ravine. At least then it would be over. The casual way he said it sent a chill through her. Don't? Don't what? Don't talk like your life doesn't matter. Mara leaned forward, her voice fierce. You saved my daughter. You've helped my family. You matter, Mr. Hale, whether you believe it or not. Gideon stared at her, something like surprise flickering in his eyes. Then he looked away, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough. You're a good woman, Mrs. Whitlock. Better than I deserve. I'm just a woman trying to do right by my children, Mara said. Same as anyone. Before Gideon could respond, the door burst open and Jacob stumbled in, his face white with panic. Mama! He gasped. There's riders coming? The cabin erupted into motion. Mara grabbed the rifle while Thomas herded the younger children toward the back room. Gideon was on his feet despite his injuries, his hand going automatically to his belt, where a knife would have been if Mara hadn't taken it when she'd undressed him. How many? Mara demanded. 3, Jacob said, panting. Maybe 4. I couldn't tell in the dark. Mara crossed to the window and peered out through the gap in the shutters. Sure enough, there were lights moving up the valley road, torches or lanterns bobbing in the darkness. Riders, coming fast. Could be anyone, Thomas said, but his voice was tight with fear. Or it could be exactly what we're afraid of. Gideon's face was grim. If those bounty hunters tracked me here, then they're about to find out what happens when you threaten a mother protecting her children, Mara said. She checked the rifle, made sure it was loaded, and moved to the door. Thomas, get the children into the cellar. Esther, you're in charge. No matter what you hear, you stay down there until I come for you. Understand? Esther's eyes were huge, but she nodded. Mama, I should stay, Thomas protested. No, you should protect your sisters and brothers. That's what I need you to do. For a second, Thomas looked like he was going to argue. Then he grabbed Jacob's hand and started gathering the others. Come on, now. They disappeared through the trapdoor in the kitchen floor, and Mara heard the soft thud as Thomas pulled it shut behind them. Then it was just her and Gideon, standing in the firelight, waiting. You should hide too, Mara said. Not a chance. Mr. Hale, I'm not letting you face this alone. Gideon's voice was flat, final. You've done enough for me. More than enough. If they're here because of me, then I'm the one who needs to deal with it. Mara wanted to argue, but there was no time. The riders were close now. She could hear the jingle of harness, the crunch of hooves in snow. She positioned herself by the door, rifle ready, and waited. The knock, when it came, was hard and authoritative. Not a friendly neighbor checking in, not someone who'd turn around if she didn't answer. Open up, a man's voice shouted. We know you're in there. Mara's finger tightened on the trigger. Beside her, Gideon was tense as a drawn bowstring. What do you want? Mara called back. We're looking for a fugitive. Dangerous man, wanted for desertion and murder. We have reason to believe he came through here. Murder. They'd added murder to the charges. Mara's blood went cold. There's no one here but me and my children, she said. Then you won't mind if we take a look around. I mind plenty. This is private property, and you're not welcome. There was a pause, then a different voice, smoother and more cultured. Mrs. Whitlock, is it? My name is Calder Voss. I represent certain business interests in the territory. I assure you, we mean you no harm. We simply need to verify that the fugitive we're tracking hasn't taken refuge here. Calder Voss. Mara knew that name. He owned half the land in the valley, bought up from desperate homesteaders who couldn't make their claims work. David had refused to sell to him, even when things got hard, and Voss hadn't liked it. I know who you are, Mr. Voss, Mara said. And I'm telling you the same thing I'd tell anyone else. You're not coming in my house. I'm afraid I must insist. Voss's voice hardened. We have legal authority to search any property where we have reasonable cause to believe. You have no authority here, Mara interrupted. This is my land, and unless you have a warrant signed by a judge, you can turn around and ride back where you came from. Another pause, longer this time. Mara could feel them calculating, weighing their options. Then Voss spoke again, and his voice was cold as the wind outside. Very well, Mrs. Whitlock. We'll return with proper documentation. But I should warn you, harboring a fugitive is a crime. If we find that you've been sheltering this man, you'll face serious consequences, you and your children. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Mara's hands tightened on the rifle, but she kept her voice steady. Good night, Mr. Voss. She heard them talking outside, low voices she couldn't make out. Then finally the sound of horses moving away, the crunch of hooves fading into the distance. Mara waited until she couldn't hear them anymore before she let herself breathe. Her legs felt weak, and she had to lean against the doorframe to keep from collapsing. They'll be back, Gideon said quietly. With a warrant, or without one, Voss doesn't strike me as the type who cares much about legal niceties. I know. Mara set the rifle down with shaking hands. I need to get the children. She opened the trap door to find 5 pale faces staring up at her from the darkness. It's all right, she said, though it wasn't. They're gone. The children climbed out one by one, and Alice immediately attached herself to Mara's leg, trembling. Mara picked her up and held her close, looking over her daughter's head at Gideon. You need to leave, she said. Tonight, before they come back. In the dark? With my injuries? Gideon shook his head. I wouldn't make it 5 miles. Then I'll give you supplies, a fresh horse, whatever you need. Mama, no, Thomas said. He was looking at Gideon with something that might have been the beginning of understanding. If he runs now, they'll know we were hiding him. They'll come after us anyway. Gideon and Mara both stared at him. He's right, Gideon said slowly. If I disappear tonight, Voss will assume you helped me. He'll use it as an excuse to take your land, to threaten your family. Your only chance is if I stay, if we can prove I was never here. How do we prove that when half the valley probably knows by now? Mara demanded. We don't, but we buy time. Gideon's expression was calculating now, strategic. Voss said he'd come back with a warrant. That'll take at least a day, maybe 2. In that time, I can try to reach someone who might be able to help. Someone who knows the truth about what happened. After 12 years, Mara said skeptically, who's going to help you now? I don't know, but I have to try. Gideon looked at each of the children in turn, then back at Mara. Because if I don't, you're right. I'm just going to keep running until I'm dead, and I'm tired of running. Mara wanted to scream at him, to shake him, to demand that he stop being noble and just save himself. But she could see the determination in his face, the way his shoulders had straightened despite the pain he must be in. He'd made his choice. All right, she said finally. We do this your way. But Mr. Hale, if you're staying, then you're going to tell me exactly what we're up against. All of it. No more secrets. Gideon nodded slowly. All right. They talked long into the night after the children were asleep, and with every word Gideon spoke, Mara felt the situation grow more complicated and more dangerous. The men who'd framed him weren't just corrupt officers. They were connected to powerful people, people with money and influence who'd spent 12 years making sure Gideon stayed discredited and on the run. And Calder Voss, it turned out, wasn't just a land baron. He'd been one of the suppliers who'd sold military goods during the war, goods that should have gone to soldiers, but instead went to the highest bidder. He's part of it, Gideon said, part of the network that destroyed me. I didn't realize it until I saw him tonight, but I recognize him. He was at the camp, selling to the officers. He knows who I am and what I know, and he can't afford to let me talk. Mara felt cold dread settle in her bones. So this isn't just about the bounty. No. It's about making sure I never tell my story. And if I disappear out here in the middle of nowhere, with no witnesses—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "Then we need proof," Mara said. "Real proof. Something that can clear your name and take down the people who did this to you." I had proof. Documents, testimony from other soldiers, but when I ran, I had to leave it all behind. By now, it's probably been destroyed. "Then we get new proof." Mara stood and began to pace, her mind working. "There have to be records. Official records that can't be erased. And there have to be other people who know the truth, soldiers who served with you, people who saw what happened." "Most of them are probably dead," Gideon said quietly. "And the ones who aren't, they won't risk speaking up, not after seeing what happened to me." "Maybe. Or maybe they've been waiting for someone to ask." Mara stopped pacing and looked at him. "You said you had a friend who helped you escape. Is he still alive?" "Last I heard, yes, but that was 5 years ago." "What's his name?" "Marcus Webb. He was a lieutenant stationed at Fort Benton after the war." Fort Benton. 2 days' ride north, if the weather held. Mara's mind raced through possibilities, risks, calculations. It was dangerous. It was probably stupid, but it might be the only chance they had. "I'll go," she said. Gideon's head snapped up. "What?" "I'll ride to Fort Benton and find Marcus Webb. If he can verify your story, if he can provide testimony or point us to records." "Absolutely not," Gideon said. "Mrs. Whitlock, you can't. The roads are dangerous, the weather's unpredictable, and if Voss finds out you've gone, then Thomas will tell him I went to town for supplies, which is true. We need supplies anyway." Mara's voice was firm, decided. "You can't go yourself. You're too injured, and if Voss's men are watching, they'll spot you immediately. But a widow making a supply run? That's normal. Expected, even. It's too dangerous. Everything about this situation is dangerous." Mara met his eyes. "But you saved my daughter's life, Mr. Hale, and I'm not going to let them destroy you for telling the truth, not if there's something I can do to stop it." Gideon stared at her like he'd never seen her before. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right. But you take my horse. He's faster than anything you've got. And you carry this." He pulled something from inside his shirt, a small leather pouch on a cord. "Marcus will recognize it. It'll prove you came from me." Mara took the pouch. Inside was a worn military medal and a photograph so faded she could barely make out the faces. "What is this?" "Proof that I'm not the man they say I am." Gideon's voice was rough, or at least proof that I used to be someone worth saving. Mara closed her hand around the pouch and felt the weight of everything they were about to risk settle on her shoulders, but she didn't waver. "I leave at first light," she said. And when dawn came, cold and clear, she did. The horse's breath came in white plumes as Mara guided him through the narrow pass, ice crackling under his hooves. She'd been riding for 6 hours, and the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of gold and amber that would have been beautiful if she hadn't been so cold. Her fingers were numb inside her gloves, her face stiff from the wind, and every muscle in her body ached from holding herself tense against the possibility of falling. Behind her, the valley had long since disappeared. Ahead, the mountains rose like walls, and somewhere beyond them was Fort Benton and the man who might be able to save Gideon's life. If he was still there, if he was still alive, if he was willing to help. Too many ifs. But Mara had stopped being able to afford certainty the moment she dragged a bleeding stranger into her cabin. She'd left before dawn, while the children were still sleeping. Thomas had woken as she was saddling Gideon's horse, and they'd stood in the barn in the pre-dawn darkness, not speaking for a long moment. "You're really doing this," Thomas had said finally. "I am." "What if Voss comes back while you're gone?" "Then you tell him exactly what I told you to tell him. That I went to town for supplies and medicine for Alice, that I should be back in 3 days. Mara had tightened the saddle cinch, her hands moving with practiced efficiency even though they were shaking. "And if he tries to come in the house, you show him the rifle and you tell him he's not welcome." "Mama, I know what I'm asking you to do." She'd turned to face him then, this boy who was trying so hard to be a man. "I know it's not fair, but Thomas, if there's even a chance that we can fix this, that we can help Mr. Hale and keep our family safe, then I have to try." Thomas had looked at her for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he'd nodded, stiff and reluctant. Be careful. Always am. That's a lie, and we both know it. But there'd been the ghost of a smile on his face, quickly hidden. Mara had hugged him then, hard and quick, and mounted up before she could change her mind. Now, hours later and miles away, she tried not to think about what might be happening back at the cabin. Tried not to imagine Voss returning with his men. Tried not to picture Thomas standing alone against them with nothing but a rifle and his father's stubborn pride. The horse stumbled on a patch of ice, and Mara's attention snapped back to the present. She steadied him with her knees and her voice, murmuring reassurances she didn't entirely feel. Gideon had been right about the animal. He was strong and sure-footed, with the kind of endurance that came from good breeding and better care. The kind of horse a man running for his life would choose. The kind of horse that might make the difference between living and dying. By the time she reached the way station at Copper Creek, the sun was setting and her entire body felt like one solid bruise. The station was a low-slung building made of logs and hope, squatting beside the frozen creek like something that had grown out of the landscape rather than been built on it. Smoke rose from the chimney, and lamplight glowed warm in the windows. Mara dismounted stiffly and led the horse to the stable, where a grizzled man with one eye and tobacco-stained teeth took the reins. "Storm's coming," he said by way of greeting. "You planning to ride through the night?" "I was hoping to," Mara said. The man spat into the straw. "Then you're a fool. Weather turns bad up in the passes, you'll freeze before you find shelter. Better to wait it out here." Mara looked at the darkening sky and knew he was right, even though every instinct she had screamed at her to keep moving. "How much for a bed?" "2 bits. Supper's another dime." She paid him and went inside, where a tired-looking woman was serving stew to a handful of travelers. Mara found a seat in the corner as far from the others as she could get, and tried to make herself invisible. It didn't work. "You traveling alone?" The question came from a man across the room, thick-shouldered and mean-eyed, with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. "That's my business," Mara said. "Dangerous for a woman alone. Lot of bad sorts on these roads. I can take care of myself." The man grinned, showing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "I bet you can. Still, might be safer if you had some company. Me and my partner here, we're headed north. Could ride with you if you want. Protection." His partner, a wiry man with nervous hands, laughed. It wasn't a friendly sound. Mara's hand went to the knife at her belt, hidden beneath her coat. "I appreciate the offer, but I'll manage." "You sure? Gets lonely out there. And cold. Might be nice to have someone to keep you warm." The room had gone quiet. The woman serving stew had stopped moving, her face carefully blank, and the other travelers were suddenly very interested in their food. Mara recognized the situation for what it was. A test to see if she'd back down or fight back. She met the man's eyes and let him see exactly how little she was afraid of him. "Touch me," she said quietly, "and you'll lose the hand. Try anything worse, and you won't live long enough to regret it." The man's grin faltered. He'd expected her to be scared or to play coy or to need rescuing. He hadn't expected her to look at him like she was calculating which piece of him to cut off first. "Easy now," he said, raising his hands. "Just making friendly conversation." "Then make it with someone else." She turned back to her stew, and after a moment the man and his partner went back to their own table. But Mara could feel them watching her for the rest of the meal, and when she went to her room, a narrow space barely big enough for a cot and a washstand, she wedged a chair under the door handle and kept the knife within reach all night. She didn't sleep well. Every creak of the floorboards, every muffled voice from the common room below had her reaching for the blade. But morning came without incident, and when she went down to settle her bill, the 2 men were gone. "They left early," the one-eyed stable keeper said when she asked. "Headed north, like they said. You want to be careful, miss. Those boys had the look of trouble about them." "I noticed," Mara said dryly. She rode out into a world transformed by fresh snow, the landscape so white and clean it hurt to look at. The storm the stable keeper had predicted had come and gone during the night, leaving behind drifts that reached the horse's knees in places. It would have been impassable if Mara had tried to travel in the dark. Still, she pushed hard, stopping only to rest the horse and eat the jerky and hardtack she'd brought. By late afternoon, the terrain had started to change. The tight mountain passes giving way to rolling hills, and in the distance she could see the dark line of the Missouri River cutting through the snow. Fort Benton sat on the river's edge like a collection of children's blocks, square and practical and entirely lacking in charm. Mara had been there once before, years ago, when David had brought her along on a trip to sell horses. She remembered it as loud and crowded, full of soldiers and traders and the kind of rough frontier energy that made her nervous. Now, in the fading light, it looked almost peaceful. Almost. She rode through the gates and into the fort's courtyard, where a young soldier with a peach fuzz mustache stopped her. "Help you, ma'am?" "I'm looking for someone," Mara said. "Lieutenant Marcus Webb. Is he stationed here?" The soldier's expression shifted, became more guarded. "Who's asking?" "A friend of a friend. It's important." "Lieutenant Webb doesn't take visitors without an appointment." "Then I'll wait until he can see me." Mara dismounted, her legs nearly giving out after 2 days in the saddle. "Is there somewhere I can stable my horse?" The soldier looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Mara's face must have convinced him not to. He directed her to the stable and told her to report to the officers' quarters when she was done. The stable was warm and smelled of hay and horse sweat. Mara took her time unsaddling Gideon's horse, checking him over for injuries, making sure he had feed and water. The animal had carried her faithfully through conditions that would have broken lesser horses, and she owed him that much. When she finally made her way to the officers' quarters, a different soldier, older, with sergeant stripes, met her at the door. "You're the one asking about Lieutenant Webb?" "I am." "He's busy. You can come back tomorrow." "I need to see him today." Mara pulled the leather pouch from inside her coat and held it out. "Give him this. Tell him it's from Gideon Hale. He'll know what it means." The sergeant's eyes narrowed, but he took the pouch. "Wait here." He disappeared into the building, and Mara stood in the cold, watching soldiers move across the courtyard in formations that looked almost like dancing. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Mara was starting to think the sergeant had forgotten about her when the door opened again and a man stepped out. He was tall, with graying hair and the kind of face that had seen too much and held on to it anyway. He wore a lieutenant's uniform, but he moved like someone who'd long since stopped caring about appearances, and in his hand he held the leather pouch. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was rough, suspicious. "Mara Whitlock. Gideon sent me." "Gideon's dead." "No, he's not. He's alive and he needs your help." Marcus Webb stared at her like she had just told him the sun rose in the west. Then, slowly, he stepped aside and gestured to the door. "You better come in." His office was small and cluttered, filled with papers and maps and the accumulated debris of a military career. He cleared a chair for Mara and sat down behind his desk, still holding the pouch. "Where is he?" Webb asked. "Somewhere safe, for now." Mara leaned forward. "Mr. Webb, I don't have time to explain everything, but Gideon is in trouble. Serious trouble. There are men hunting him, men who want to make sure he never tells the truth about what happened during the war. And if we can't prove his innocence, they're going to kill him." Webb's jaw tightened. "What do you need from me?" "Testimony, records, anything that can verify his story about the corruption at the camp, about the supplies that were being sold, about the officers who framed him." "That was 12 years ago," Webb said. "Most of the men involved are dead or discharged. The records, if they even still exist, would be buried in some archive in Washington." "But you were there. You know what happened." "I know what I saw, but my word alone won't be enough. Not against the people who did this." Webb opened the pouch and looked at the metal inside. Mara saw something shift in his expression, pain, or maybe regret. "I helped Gideon escape because I knew they'd hang him if I didn't, but I couldn't do more than that. I had a wife, children. I couldn't risk them." "I understand," Mara said, and she did. She understood exactly the kind of choice Webb had made because she was making the same kind of choices now. "But Mr. Webb, things have changed. The men hunting Gideon aren't just soldiers following orders. They're connected to something bigger. There's a man named Calder Voss." Webb's head snapped up. "Voss? Calder Voss? You know him?" "I know of him. He was one of the biggest war profiteers in the territory, made a fortune selling supplies to both sides. Didn't matter to him who won as long as he got paid." Webb stood and began to pace, his agitation obvious. After the war, he bought up land, businesses, political influence. He's untouchable now. If he's involved in this, then we need proof that he was part of the corruption, Mara finished. Something that ties him to what happened to Gideon. Webb stopped pacing and looked at her. Mrs. Whitlock, you have any idea what you're asking? Voss has lawyers, judges, politicians in his pocket. You go after him. You better be damn sure you can take him down, because if you fail, he'll destroy you and everyone you love. He's already trying to destroy us, Mara said. He showed up at my homestead 2 nights ago, threatening my family. So I don't have the luxury of being careful anymore, Mr. Webb. I need your help. For a long moment, Webb didn't speak. He just stood there, looking at the metal in his hand, and Mara could see him weighing the risks, calculating the cost. Finally, he said, There might be something. When I helped Gideon escape, I took copies of some documents he'd gathered, testimony from soldiers, supply manifests that showed the discrepancies. I hid them, thinking maybe someday they'd be useful. I don't know if they're still there, but where? Mara demanded. My family's old place, about 30 miles west of here. Abandoned now, but there's a cellar. I buried a lockbox there, wrapped in oilcloth. If it survived, he shook his head. It's a long shot, Mrs. Whitlock. Long shots are all I have right now. Mara stood. Can you draw me a map? Webb looked at her like she was crazy. You're going tonight? I'm going right now. Every hour I waste is another hour Voss has to make his move. The place is 30 miles through rough country. You'll never make it before dark, and riding at night in this weather is suicide. Then I'll be very careful not to die. Mara met his eyes. Mr. Webb, I have 5 children waiting for me at home, and a man I barely know risking his life because he refused to stay silent about injustice. I don't have time to be sensible. I need that box, and I need it now. Webb stared at her. Then slowly, he smiled, a tired, bitter smile that didn't reach his eyes. Gideon always did have a talent for inspiring loyalty in unlikely people. All right, Mrs. Whitlock, I'll draw you a map. But if you get yourself killed, I'm going to feel terrible about it. If I get myself killed, I won't care how you feel, Mara said. The map was crude but clear. Landmarks, distances, warnings about places where the trail got dangerous. Mara studied it until she had it memorized, then tucked it inside her coat next to the leather pouch. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Webb replied. You haven't found the box, and even if you do, even if the documents are still readable, it might not be enough. It'll have to be. Mara headed for the door, then paused. Mr. Webb, when this is over, when Gideon's name is cleared, he'll want to know that you tried to help. I'll make sure he knows. Webb's expression softened slightly. Tell him I'm sorry for not doing more back then. Tell him yourself, Mara said. Once we win. She rode out of Fort Benton as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. The horse was tired, and so was she, but there was no time to rest. Webb had been right about the darkness. Within an hour, she could barely see the trail ahead, and she had to trust the horse to find his footing. The cold was brutal. Even with her heavy coat and wool scarf wrapped around her face, Mara could feel it seeping into her bones, making her movements slow and clumsy. Her hands ached where they gripped the reins, and her feet had gone numb in the stirrups. But she kept going. The abandoned homestead appeared out of the darkness like a ghost, a sagging cabin with holes in the roof, a barn that had collapsed on one side, fences broken and buried in snow. It looked like it had been empty for years, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. Mara dismounted and tied the horse to what was left of the porch railing. Then, carrying a lantern she'd borrowed from Fort Benton, she made her way around to the back of the cabin where Webb had said the cellar entrance would be. It took her 20 minutes of digging through snow and frozen earth to find the door, a wooden hatch set into the ground, half-rotted and covered with debris. She pried it open with the blade of her knife and peered down into darkness that smelled of damp earth and decay. The ladder was still there, rickety but holding. Mara descended carefully, testing each rung before trusting it with her weight. The cellar was small and cramped, the ceiling so low she had to hunch. And when she raised the lantern, she saw stone walls slick with moisture and a dirt floor littered with the remains of stored vegetables that had long since rotted away. Webb had said the box was buried in the northeast corner, beneath a flat stone. Mara found the stone easily enough. It was the only part of the floor that looked deliberately placed, but when she tried to lift it, it wouldn't budge. She set the lantern down and used both hands, ignoring the way her injured muscles screamed in protest. The stone shifted, then lifted, revealing a dark hole beneath. And there, wrapped in oilcloth, just as Webb had described, was a metal lockbox. Mara pulled it out with shaking hands. The cloth had protected it. The box was intact, the lock still holding. She tried to open it, but it was sealed tight. She'd have to break it open back at the cabin, where she had tools and light. Carefully, she wrapped it back in the oilcloth and tucked it under her arm. Then she climbed back up the ladder and out into the freezing night. The ride back to Fort Benton took half the night. By the time she reached the fort, Mara was so exhausted she could barely stay in the saddle. She reported to Webb's quarters and found him still awake, sitting at his desk with a bottle of whiskey and a haunted expression. "You found it," he said when he saw the box. "I found it." Mara set it on his desk. "But it's locked, and I don't have the key." "I do." Webb pulled a small key from his pocket and held it up. Kept it all these years, just in case. He unlocked the box and lifted the lid, and they both leaned forward to see what was inside. Papers. Dozens of them, yellowed with age but still legible. Supply manifests showing discrepancies between what was ordered and what was delivered. Testimony from soldiers describing the conditions in camp, the lack of food and medicine, the officers who lived in luxury while men died. And at the bottom, a letter, signed by 4 officers, including one whose name Mara recognized, Colonel Arthur Voss, Calder's father. "This is it," Webb said quietly. "This is proof that the Voss family was involved in the corruption, that they profited from it. If we can get this in front of the right people—" "We will," Mara said. "But first, I need to get it home. I need to get it to Gideon." Webb looked up at her. "Mrs. Whitlock, if Voss finds out you have this, then he'll do what he was always planning to do anyway. But at least now we have a chance to fight back." Mara carefully gathered the documents and placed them back in the box. "Thank you, Mr. Webb, for keeping these. For helping." "I should have helped 12 years ago," Webb said. "Maybe if I had—" "You did what you could. That's all any of us can do." Mara picked up the box. "I need to leave at first light. Can you arrange for a fresh horse? Mine's earned a rest." Webb nodded. "I'll have one ready. And Mrs. Whitlock? Be careful. Voss has people everywhere. If he finds out what you're carrying—" "I know." Mara managed a tired smile. "But I'm a widow with 5 children and a failing homestead. I've been fighting battles I can't win for 2 years now. I'm used to it." She slept in the fort's guest quarters that night, the lockbox under her pillow and her knife in her hand. And when dawn came, she mounted the fresh horse Webb had provided, a strong roan mare with kind eyes, and rode south toward home. The journey back was faster than the journey north had been, but it felt longer. Every shadow looked like a potential threat, every sound like hoofbeats. Mara found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, expecting to see Voss's men or bounty hunters, or worse. But the miles passed without incident, and by the afternoon of the second day, she could see the familiar peaks that marked the valley where her homestead lay. She was less than 5 miles from home when she heard the gunshot. It came from ahead, sharp and clear in the cold air. Then another, and Mara's blood turned to ice. She kicked the mare into a gallop, the lockbox clutched tight against her chest, and raced toward the sound. The horse responded beautifully, eating up the distance with powerful strides, but every second felt like an eternity. The cabin came into view, and Mara's worst fears materialized in front of her. There were riders in her yard, 5 of them, including Calder Voss himself, unmistakable in his expensive coat and fur-lined hat. They'd surrounded the cabin, and Thomas was on the porch, the rifle raised to his shoulder, his face white with terror and determination. Inside the cabin, Mara could see movement, Gideon at the window, and behind him the flash of Esther's blonde hair as she tried to pull the younger children to safety. "Put the rifle down, boy," Voss was saying. His voice was calm, almost pleasant. "We have legal authority to search this property. You're interfering with the law." "You're not the law," Thomas shouted back. His voice cracked, but the rifle didn't waver. "And you're not coming in." "I'm afraid I have to insist." Voss gestured, and 2 of his men dismounted and started toward the porch. Thomas fired. The shot went wide, deliberately, Mara thought, but it stopped the men in their tracks. One of them reached for his own gun, and Mara saw everything about to spiral out of control, saw her son about to start a gunfight he couldn't win, saw her family about to be destroyed. She rode into the yard at full gallop, the mare scattering snow and ice, and threw herself from the saddle before the animal had even stopped moving. "Get away from my house!" she screamed. Every head turned. Voss's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in calculation as he saw the lockbox in her arms. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said smoothly. "How nice of you to join us. We were just explaining to your son that we have a warrant to search your property for a dangerous fugitive." "Show me the warrant," Mara demanded. Voss pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it up. Signed by Judge Morrison himself. Everything completely legal and proper. Judge Morrison. Another man in Voss's pocket, no doubt. Mara looked at the paper and saw that it was, indeed, a proper warrant, which meant Voss had the legal right to search her home, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. Unless... "Mr. Voss," Mara said, her voice steady despite the fear screaming through her veins, "I have a proposition for you." Voss raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Mara held up the lockbox. "Inside this box are documents that prove Gideon Hale was innocent of the charges against him. Documents that also prove your father was involved in war, profiteering, and corruption. Documents that, if made public, would destroy your family's reputation and probably land you in prison." The pleasant expression on Voss's face didn't change, but Mara saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, or maybe recognition. "That's quite a claim," Voss said. "I can prove it. I have testimony, manifests, letters signed by your father, everything." Mara took a breath. "So here's my proposition. You leave my property right now. You drop the charges against Gideon Hale, and I don't take these documents to the federal marshal and the newspapers. And if I refuse, then I do it anyway, and we both lose. You destroy my family, and I destroy yours." The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in that yard, Voss's men, Thomas on the porch, even the horses, seemed to be holding their breath. Voss smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "You're bluffing," he said. "Those documents, if they even exist, were lost years ago. And even if you somehow found them, they're worthless." Ancient history. No one cares about corruption from a war that ended over a decade ago. "Then you won't mind me making them public," Mara said. Voss's smile faded. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Mrs. Whitlock. The people I'm connected to, the power they have, you can't fight them. You can't win. Maybe not, but I can make sure you lose." Mara met his eyes. "Your choice, Mr. Voss. Walk away now, or we all go down together." For a long moment, Voss didn't move. Then he glanced at the lockbox, at Mara's determined face, at Thomas still standing on the porch with the rifle. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Yes, it is," Mara replied. "It's over because I'm making it over. Now get off my land." Voss stared at her a moment longer. Then he gestured to his men, and they mounted up. But before he rode away, he leaned down from his saddle and spoke so quietly only Mara could hear. "You just made a very dangerous enemy, Mrs. Whitlock. I hope those documents are worth what they're going to cost you." Then he was gone, and his men with him, leaving only hoof prints in the snow and the acrid smell of gunpowder in the air. Mara stood there, shaking, until she couldn't see them anymore. Then her legs gave out, and she sat down hard in the snow, still clutching the lockbox. The cabin door flew open, and Thomas was running toward her, and behind him came Gideon, moving stiffly but moving. And then the other children were pouring out, and they were all talking at once, asking if she was all right, asking what happened, asking if it was really over. Mara looked up at them, at her children, at Gideon, at this family she'd risked everything to protect, and felt something inside her finally break open. "It's over," she said. "It's not finished, but it's over." And then, finally, she let herself cry. They brought her inside and sat her by the fire, and Esther pressed a cup of hot coffee into her hands while the twins hovered nearby, their faces pinched with worry. Alice climbed into Mara's lap without asking permission and buried her face in her mother's neck, and Mara held her with one arm while the other stayed wrapped around the lockbox. "You scared us half to death," Thomas said. His voice was rough, angry in the way people got when fear turned into relief. We heard the gunshots and thought, I know what you thought. Mara looked at him over Alice's head. I'm sorry, but I had to make Voss believe I'd use these documents if he pushed me. Would you have? Gideon asked quietly. He was standing by the window, keeping watch, but his eyes were on Mara. Yes, she said, and meant it. Gideon nodded slowly, something like respect flickering across his face. Then he turned back to the window, his shoulders tense. He'll come back, Thomas said. You know he will. Men like that don't just walk away. Maybe not, Mara agreed. But we bought ourselves time, and time is what we need. She set Alice down gently and opened the lockbox on the table. The documents looked fragile in the firelight, the paper so old it seemed like it might crumble at a touch. But the words were still clear, and as Gideon leaned over to read them, Mara saw his face go pale. This is it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This is everything I tried to report. Everything they buried. His hand shook as he picked up one of the manifests. Marcus kept this. All these years he kept it. He said to tell you he was sorry, Mara said, for not doing more. He did enough. Gideon's throat worked as he looked through the documents, his eyes moving rapidly over names and numbers that clearly meant something to him. This is proof, real proof. If we can get this to someone who'll actually listen. The federal marshal in Helena, Mara said. Webb told me he's honest. One of the few who can't be bought. Helena's 4 days' ride from here, Thomas pointed out. Maybe 5 in this weather, and Voss will be watching the roads. Then we don't take the roads, Gideon said. He was already moving to the map on the wall, the one David had drawn years ago showing the valley and the surrounding territory. There's a pass through the eastern range. It's rough, especially this time of year, but if we can make it through— We? Mara interrupted. Gideon turned to look at her. You didn't think I was going to let you ride to Helena alone, did you? Mr. Hale, you can barely stand without wincing. You're in no condition to travel. I'm in better condition than I was 3 days ago, thanks to you. And these are my documents, my story. I should be the one to deliver them. And when Voss's men recognize you and shoot you dead before you make it 10 miles? Mara shook her head. No, I'll go. I'm just a widow seeking justice. No one will pay attention to me until it's too late. Mama, you can't go again, Esther said quietly. She'd been standing in the corner listening, and now she came forward. You just got back. You're exhausted. And if you leave again— Her voice cracked. What if you don't come back this time? The fear in her daughter's eyes cut Mara deeper than any words could have. She reached out and pulled Esther close, feeling how thin the girl had gotten, how much weight she'd lost trying to keep the household running while Mara focused on survival. I know, Mara murmured. I know I'm asking too much of all of you, but sweetheart, if we don't see this through, if we let Voss win, then we lose everything anyway. The homestead, our safety, our future. This is our chance to end it. Then I'll go, Thomas said suddenly. Every head in the room turned toward him. I'm old enough, strong enough. I can ride to Helena, deliver the documents. Absolutely not, Mara said. Why not? Because I'm a kid? Thomas's voice rose. I'm not, Mama. I haven't been for a long time. You know it and I know it, so stop treating me like I can't handle this. It's not about whether you can handle it. It's about you being scared to lose me, Thomas interrupted. Like you lost Papa. I know, but you can't protect me forever. And right now, the family needs someone to make this ride, and I'm the best choice. You're needed here to keep the homestead running. Mr. Hale can't go because he's wanted, so it has to be me. Mara stared at her son, this boy who wasn't a boy anymore, and felt something shift inside her. He was right. She hated that he was right, but he was. No, Gideon said before Mara could respond. Not alone. If Thomas goes, I go with him. That's suicide, Mara said flatly. Maybe. Or maybe it's the only way to make sure he gets there safely. Gideon moved away from the window and sat down at the table, his movements careful. Listen, Voss knows you, Mrs. Whitlock. He knows what you look like, knows your horse. If you try to ride to Helena, his men will spot you before you leave the valley. But Thomas? He's just a kid running an errand. No one looks twice at kids. Except when they're traveling with a wanted fugitive, Thomas pointed out. Then I won't look like a wanted fugitive. I'll be your uncle, traveling with you to help sell horses or buy supplies or whatever story we decide on. We stick to back trails, avoid towns where people might recognize me, and keep moving. Gideon looked at Mara. It's risky. I won't pretend it isn't. But it's less risky than you going alone, and it's less risky than sending Thomas alone. Mara wanted to argue. Every instinct she had screamed at her to lock Thomas in the cabin and go herself, to keep him safe no matter what it cost. But she'd spent 2 years trying to protect her children by carrying every burden herself, and it hadn't worked. They were still struggling, still vulnerable, still one bad winter away from losing everything. Maybe it was time to start trusting them to carry some of the weight. All right, she said, the words feeling like they were being dragged out of her. But Thomas, you listen to Mr. Hale. If he tells you to run, you run. If he tells you to hide, you hide. Understood? Thomas nodded, his expression serious, understood. And Mr. Hale, Mara turned to Gideon, if anything happens to my son, if you let him get hurt trying to protect you, I won't, Gideon said quietly. You have my word. They spent the rest of the evening preparing. Gideon studied the map, plotting a route that would take them through the mountain passes and around the areas where Voss had the most influence. Mara packed supplies, food, blankets, extra ammunition, medicine. Thomas checked and rechecked the horses, making sure they were sound and ready for hard travel. And through it all, Mara felt the knot of fear in her stomach growing tighter. That night, after the younger children were in bed, Mara sat with Thomas in front of the fire. Neither of them spoke for a long time, just sat there listening to the crackle of the flames and the wind outside. Are you scared? Mara asked finally. Terrified, Thomas admitted. But I'm more scared of what happens if I don't go. If we lose the homestead because we didn't have the courage to fight for it. He looked at her, and in the firelight, he looked so much like David it made her chest ache. Papa would have gone. You know he would have. Your papa would have wanted you safe. He would have wanted all of us safe and free, and not living under the shadow of men like Voss. Thomas's jaw set. I can do this, Mama. I know I can. Mara reached out and took his hand, this hand that had gotten so much bigger without her noticing, calloused from work and rough from the cold. I know you can, she said. I just wish you didn't have to. They left before dawn, slipping out of the cabin like ghosts. Mara stood on the porch and watched them ride away. Thomas on his father's old gelding, Gideon on the roan mare Mara had brought back from Fort Benton, until they disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. Then she went back inside and tried to figure out how she was going to survive the next 4 days. The answer turned out to be work, endless, exhausting work that kept her hands busy and her mind from spinning into panic. She mucked out the barn, repaired fence posts, split firewood until her shoulders screamed. She cooked meals the children barely touched because they were all too worried to eat. She read to Alice at night and helped the twins with their lessons and tried to pretend everything was normal when nothing was normal at all. And every night she stood at the window and watched the road, waiting for riders that didn't come. On the third day, Esther found her sitting at the table, staring at nothing. Mama? Esther's voice was soft, careful. Are you all right? I don't know, Mara said honestly. Ask me when Thomas comes home. Esther sat down across from her, folding her hands in her lap the way she did when she was thinking hard about something. He'll come back. He's stubborn like you. Despite everything, Mara smiled. That's supposed to make me feel better? It should. Stubbornness keeps people alive. Esther paused. Mama, can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you help Mr. Hale? When you found him, you could have just left him outside. No one would have blamed you, but you didn't. Mara thought about how to answer that. Because leaving him would have been the safe thing to do. And I'm tired of being safe if it means being the kind of person who turns her back on someone in need. Even when it puts us in danger? Even then. Because what's the point of keeping you all safe if I teach you that survival matters more than doing what's right? Mara reached across the table and took Esther's hand. Your papa used to say that the measure of a person wasn't what they did when it was easy. It was what they did when it was hard, when it cost them something. What if it costs us everything? Then at least we'll know we fought for what mattered. Mara squeezed her daughter's hand. I can't promise you it'll all work out, Esther. I can't promise Thomas will come home safe, or that Voss won't find another way to come after us. but I can promise you that I'll keep fighting for this family as long as I have breath in my body." Esther's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "I know, Mama. I know you will." On the fourth day, a rider appeared on the road. Mara saw him from the barn, where she was tending to a mare with a stone bruise. She dropped the hoof pick and ran for the cabin, shouting for the children to get inside. By the time she reached the porch with the rifle in her hands, the rider was close enough to recognize. Not Thomas, not Gideon. A stranger, dressed in the dark coat and badge of a federal marshal. Mara's heart stopped. The marshal reined in his horse and raised one hand in a gesture of peace. "Mrs. Whitlock? That's me." Mara's voice came out steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "What do you want?" "I'm Marshal Hayes, out of Helena. I'm here about some documents that were delivered to my office 2 days ago. Documents concerning wartime corruption and fraud." 2 days ago. Which meant Thomas and Gideon had made it. They'd actually made it. "What about them?" Mara asked carefully. "They're authentic. I verified them with military records and compared the signatures to known documents. They prove that several high-ranking officers, including Colonel Arthur Voss, were involved in systematic theft and fraud during the war." Hayes dismounted and approached the porch slowly, keeping his hands visible. "They also proved that a man named Gideon Hale was falsely accused of desertion when he tried to report the corruption." "Where's my son?" Mara demanded. "Where's Thomas?" "Safe in Helena, ma'am. He and Mr. Hale are both under federal protection while we investigate. I'm here to ask you some questions and to inform you that we'll be making arrests shortly." The relief was so intense it nearly knocked Mara off her feet. She gripped the porch railing to steady herself. "Arrests? You mean—" "I mean Calder Voss and several of his associates are about to have a very bad day." Hayes pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I also have this for you. A court order protecting your property and family from any retaliation while the case is ongoing. No one can touch you without going through me first." Mara took the paper with shaking hands. The words swam in front of her eyes, but the official seal was clear enough. Real protection. Legal protection. "There's more," Hayes said. "Mr. Hale's charges have been dismissed. All of them. He's a free man, Mrs. Whitlock, and the territorial governor wants to meet with him personally to apologize for what was done to him." Mara had to sit down. She sank onto the porch steps, still clutching the court order, and felt 12 years of injustice start to crack and crumble. "When can I see my son?" she asked. "He'll be home in 3 days once we've finished taking his statement. But he wanted me to tell you—" Hayes smiled slightly. "He wanted me to tell you he did good. That he made it, and he's proud of himself, and he hopes you're proud of him too." "I am," Mara said, her voice breaking. "Tell him I am." The next 3 days felt both endless and impossibly fast. News spread through the valley like wildfire. Federal marshals had descended on Voss's estate, armed with warrants and evidence. Arrests had been made. Not just Voss, but the judge who'd signed false warrants, the sheriff who'd looked the other way, the lawyers who'd helped cover it up. The whole corrupt network was being torn apart piece by piece, and people started coming to Mara's door. Neighbors she hadn't seen in months showed up with food, with offers to help repair the barn roof, with apologies for believing the whispers Voss had spread about her. The women from town who'd once looked at her with pity now looked at her with something close to awe. The widow who'd stood up to Calder Voss and won. Mara accepted their help and their apologies with grace she didn't entirely feel. Part of her wanted to rage at them, to demand where they'd been when she was struggling to keep her family fed, when she was doing everything alone. But another part understood that fear made people small, made them complicit in things they wouldn't normally tolerate. And she'd been afraid too. She still was. But she'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing what needed to be done despite it. On the third day, just as the sun was setting, 2 riders appeared on the road. Mara knew them immediately, the way they sat their horses, the way they moved. She'd memorized every detail in the brief time they'd been in her life. Thomas and Gideon were coming home. She didn't run. She wanted to, but she made herself walk down from the porch with dignity, made herself wait until they'd dismounted before she pulled Thomas into her arms and held him so tight he squeaked. "Can't breathe, Mama," he said, but he was laughing, and his arms came around her just as tight. "You did it," Mara said into his hair. "You brave, foolish boy. You did it." "We did it," Thomas corrected. He pulled back enough to look at her. Mr. Hale and me together. You should have seen him, Mama. The way he talked to the marshal, the way he explained everything. They believed him. They actually believed him. Mara looked over Thomas's shoulder at Gideon. He looked different somehow, taller, or maybe just lighter, as if someone had lifted a weight he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. Mr. Hale, she said. Mrs. Whitlock. Gideon's voice was rough. Thank you for everything, for risking your family, for... Stop, Mara said. You don't need to thank me. I do. You saved my life, and not just by pulling me out of the snow. You gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever. He paused. You gave me back the belief that there are still good people in the world, people worth fighting for. Before Mara could respond, the cabin door burst open and the other children came pouring out, Esther and the twins and Alice, all of them talking at once, all of them trying to hug Thomas at the same time. It was chaos and noise and joy, and Mara stood back and watched her family knit itself back together. That night they had a real celebration. Mara cooked the last of the good meat, and someone brought out David's fiddle that no one had touched in 2 years, and Thomas tried to play it and made sounds that sent Alice into fits of giggles. Gideon sat by the fire, looking more relaxed than Mara had ever seen him, while Esther peppered him with questions about Helena and the marshal and what it was like to finally tell his story. And Mara sat at the table, surrounded by her children and this man who'd stumbled into their lives and changed everything, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Later, after the children were asleep, Mara and Gideon found themselves alone by the fire. The cabin was quiet except for the soft sounds of breathing from the back room and the crackle of the flames. What will you do now? Mara asked. Now that you're free? Gideon was quiet for a long time. I don't know, he said finally. For 12 years, all I've done is run. I don't know how to do anything else. You could start by staying still, Mara suggested. See what that feels like. Here? Gideon looked at her, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. You'd want me to stay? Mara thought about it. Thought about what it would mean to have another adult in the house, someone to share the burden of keeping the homestead running. Thought about the way he was with the children, patient with Alice, respectful of Thomas's pride, gentle with Esther's quiet fears. Thought about the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. We could use the help, she said carefully. Winter's hard, and there's more work than I can manage alone. If you wanted to stay through spring, maybe longer. I'd like that, Gideon said. I'd like that a lot. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn down to embers. And Mara thought about second chances, about how sometimes the worst storms brought exactly what you needed, even if you didn't know you needed it until it was standing on your porch, half frozen and bleeding. The week after Thomas and Gideon returned, the trial began in Helena. Mara didn't attend. She couldn't leave the homestead undefended, not even for this. But she got regular updates from Marshal Hayes. The evidence was overwhelming. Voss's lawyers tried every trick they knew, but there was no talking their way around documentation signed in their client's father's hand, testimony from multiple soldiers, supply manifests that showed exactly how much they'd stolen. The verdict came down on a cold morning in late February. Guilty on all charges. Calder Voss was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The judge who'd signed false warrants was stripped of his position. The corrupt sheriff was arrested. And dozens of lesser players in Voss's network found themselves facing their own reckonings. When Hayes brought the news to the homestead, Mara listened calmly. Then she excused herself, walked out to the barn, and cried until she couldn't cry anymore. It was over. Really over. Spring came early that year, or maybe it just felt that way because Mara was finally able to see past the next crisis, the next disaster. The snow began to melt in earnest, revealing dead grass and mud and the promise of green things to come. The days got longer, the air got warmer, and the homestead, which had felt like a prison for so long, began to feel like a home again. Gideon stayed, and with his help they accomplished more in those early spring months than Mara had managed in the previous 2 years. He repaired the barn roof, fixed the broken plow, helped Thomas break a new horse to saddle. He taught Esther how to set a bone when one of the chickens broke its leg, and showed the twins how to track deer by their prints in the soft earth. He read to Alice at night when Mara was too exhausted to keep her eyes open. And slowly, carefully, Mara watched her children heal. watched Thomas let himself laugh without guilt, watched Esther stop waiting for the next disaster, watched the twins play like children instead of tiny soldiers preparing for battle. Even Alice, who'd been so fragile, began to bloom. Her cough disappeared completely, and color came back into her cheeks, and she started asking questions about everything. Why the sky was blue, where the birds went at night, whether Mr. Hale was going to stay forever. I hope so, Mara told her, but we'll have to ask him. She did, one evening when they were working together in the vegetable garden, turning over the soil to prepare for planting. Gideon was strong enough now to do heavy work, though Mara noticed he still moved carefully when he thought no one was watching, still favored his left side where the deepest wounds had been. Mr. Hale, she said, not looking up from the row she was hoeing, I've been thinking. Dangerous occupation, Gideon said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. I'm serious, I've been thinking about the future, about what happens next. All right, Gideon stopped digging and leaned on his shovel. What have you been thinking? That this homestead is too much for one person to run, that I've been trying to do it alone for too long, and it's not working. Mara finally looked up at him. I'm offering you a partnership, Mr. Hale. Half the land, half of the profits, half the decisions. In exchange for half the work and half the responsibility. Gideon stared at her. Mrs. Whitlock, I can't accept that. This land is yours, your children's legacy. This land is dirt and grass without someone to work it, and I'm offering you the chance to help me make it something more. Mara set her hoe aside. I know it's not much. The homestead's barely profitable, and the work is backbreaking, and there's no guarantee we'll make it through next winter any better than we made it through this one. But it's honest work, and it's a future. If you want it. I want it, Gideon said immediately. Then more slowly, but Mara, may I call you Mara? She nodded. Mara, I need you to understand what you'd be taking on. I have a name now, yes, and my reputation's been restored. But there will always be people who remember the accusations, who believe there's no smoke without fire. Associating with me, making me your partner, it could cost you. Let it, Mara said. I'm done making decisions based on what other people think. I'm done being afraid of what might happen if I do the thing I know is right. She held out her hand. So what do you say, Mr. Hale? Partners? Gideon looked at her hand for a long moment. Then he wiped his palm on his pants and took it. Partners, he agreed, but only if you call me Gideon. Gideon, Mara said, testing the name. It felt right in her mouth. They shook on it there in the garden, with the sun warm on their backs and the smell of turned earth rising around them, and Mara felt something settle into place inside her. This was right. This was the choice she was supposed to make. The rest would figure itself out. The partnership changed everything, though not in the ways Mara had expected. She'd thought having Gideon officially invested in the homestead would simply mean more hands for the work, another voice in the decisions. And it did mean those things, but it also meant something deeper, something she hadn't anticipated. It meant she wasn't alone anymore. Not in the way she'd been alone since David died, carrying every burden, making every choice, lying awake at night wondering if she was strong enough, smart enough, good enough to keep her children alive. With Gideon working beside her, those burdens became lighter. Not gone, but shared. And in the sharing, they became bearable. By mid-April, the valley had transformed. What had been white and frozen was now green and alive, wildflowers pushing up through the last patches of snow, the creek running high and clear with meltwater. The homestead buzzed with activity from dawn to dusk. Thomas worked with Gideon to repair fences and break the new colts. Esther planted the kitchen garden with a precision that made Mara's heart swell with pride. The twins took over responsibility for the chickens and the goats, bickering cheerfully over whose turn it was to collect eggs. And Alice followed everyone around like a golden shadow, asking her endless questions and getting in the way in the manner of 6-year-olds everywhere. On a warm evening in late April, Mara stood on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains and felt something close to contentment wash over her. The day's work was done. Supper was cooking. Her children were safe and healthy and laughing inside the cabin. And Gideon was in the barn finishing the last of the evening chores, whistling tunelessly in a way that made her smile every time she heard it. She was still standing there when Thomas came out to join her, wiping his hands on a rag. "Mama," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." Thomas leaned against the porch railing. looking out at the same view she was watching. He'd grown another inch in the past month, and his shoulders had broadened from the constant physical work. Soon he'd be taller than she was. The thought made her throat tight. "Are you happy?" he asked. The question surprised her. "What makes you ask that?" "I don't know. I realized I haven't seen you smile this much in years. Not since Papa died. Maybe not even before that. Those last few months when things were so hard." Thomas glanced at her. "Is it because of Mr. Hale? Because he's staying?" Mara considered the question carefully. "It's because of a lot of things," she said finally. "Because we're not fighting just to survive anymore. Because the threat from Voss is gone. Because I'm not carrying everything alone." She paused. "And yes, because Gideon's here. He's a good man, Thomas. A good partner. I'm grateful for his help." "Is that all he is?" Thomas asked quietly. "A partner?" Mara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you have feelings for him, more than just gratitude." Thomas was looking at her directly now, his dark eyes, so much like David's, searching her face. "Because if you do, Mama, it's all right. I want you to know that." Mara's breath caught. "Thomas." "I loved Papa," Thomas continued. "I'll always love him. But he's been gone 2 years, and you've been alone all that time. If Mr. Hale, if Gideon makes you happy, then I'm glad. We all are. Esther and me, we've talked about it. We think—" He stopped, swallowed. "We think maybe it's time for you to stop just surviving and start living again." Mara had to turn away because her eyes were burning and she didn't want Thomas to see her cry. When had her son become so wise? When had he grown up enough to worry about her happiness instead of just his own? "I don't know what I feel," she said honestly. "It's too soon, too complicated, and I don't want you children to think I'm trying to replace your father because I'm not. I could never." "We know that," Thomas said. "But Mama, loving someone new doesn't mean you loved Papa less. It just means you have room in your heart for more than one person." He put his hand on her shoulder. "You taught me that. When Alice was born, you told me I didn't have to love her less to make room for the twins. That love doesn't divide. It multiplies." Mara turned back to him and pulled him into a fierce hug. "When did you get so smart?" "I had a good teacher," Thomas said against her shoulder. They stood there for a moment, mother and son, watching the light fade from the sky. And Mara let herself think about the question Thomas had asked. Did she have feelings for Gideon? More than gratitude? More than the simple appreciation of a good partner? Yes, she admitted to herself. She did. She'd been trying not to notice it, trying to keep her focus on practical matters, the work, the children, the future of the homestead. But the truth was that somewhere between dragging him half frozen through her door and watching him teach Alice how to whistle using a blade of grass, she'd started to care for him in a way that had nothing to do with partnership and everything to do with the way her heart lifted when he smiled at her across the dinner table. It terrified her. The thought of opening herself up to that kind of vulnerability again, of giving someone the power to hurt her the way losing David had hurt. But it also filled her with a hope she'd thought was dead, the possibility that maybe her life wasn't over at 32, maybe there was still room for joy and companionship and even love. Maybe Thomas was right. Maybe it was time to stop just surviving and start living. The next day, Marcus Webb arrived at the homestead. Mara saw him coming from a distance, a lone rider on a military horse, moving at an easy pace up the valley road. She recognized him when he got closer, and her hand automatically went to the rifle she kept by the door. Not because she thought Webb meant harm, but because unexpected visitors still made her nervous. Gideon came out of the barn when he heard the hoofbeats, and he went very still when he saw who it was. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. The first real, unguarded smile Mara had seen from him. Webb dismounted, and the two men stood facing each other for a long moment. Then Webb crossed the distance between them and pulled Gideon into a hard embrace. "You stubborn fool," Webb said, his voice rough. "I heard what you did, riding all the way to Helena, walking into the marshal's office like you had nothing to lose. I thought for sure they'd arrest you on sight." "They almost did," Gideon said. "If it hadn't been for the documents you saved, if it hadn't been for Mrs. Whitlock's courage in going to get them—" "Mara," Mara corrected from the porch. Both men turned to look at her. If we're going to keep saving each other's lives, we should probably use first names. Webb grinned. Fair enough. Mara it is. He turned back to Gideon. The territorial governor wants to see you. He's talking about official pardons, public apologies, maybe even some kind of compensation for the years you lost. Gideon shook his head. I don't want compensation. I just want to be left alone to live my life. Too late for that, I'm afraid. You're a hero now. The man who stood up to corruption and won. They're going to want to make an example of you, the good kind this time. Webb's expression softened. You deserve it, Gideon. After everything they put you through, you deserve to have your name cleared completely, not just legally, but publicly. Marcus is right, Mara said, coming down from the porch. You should go to Helena, meet with the governor, let them make it official. Gideon looked at her, and she saw the conflict in his eyes. The part of him that just wanted to disappear into quiet anonymity, warring with the part that needed the vindication, needed the world to know he'd been telling the truth all along. I'll go, he said finally. But only if you come with me. Mara blinked. Me? Why? Because you're the reason any of this is possible. Because you risked everything to help me, and you deserve to be there when it's made right. Gideon took a step toward her. And because I don't want to face it alone. There was something in his voice, in the way he was looking at her, that made Mara's heart skip. This was more than just gratitude. This was, all right, she said, before she could second-guess herself. I'll come. They left for Helena 2 days later, leaving Esther in charge of the homestead with strict instructions and promises to be back within a week. Thomas wanted to come too, but Mara needed him there to help Esther with the heavy work, and he accepted the responsibility with the same serious determination he brought to everything now. The journey to Helena was nothing like Mara's frantic rides to Fort Benton and back. This time, she and Gideon traveled at an easy pace, stopping to rest the horses and make camp when the sun set. They talked during the long hours in the saddle, about their childhoods, about the people they'd lost, about the dreams they'd given up and the ones they might still reach for. Mara learned that Gideon had wanted to be a doctor not for the prestige or the money, but because he'd watched his mother die slowly and painfully and had felt helpless to stop it. That he joined the army because he thought he could save lives there, make a difference. And instead he'd watched men die from corruption and greed as much as from bullets. And Gideon learned that Mara had married David not in some grand romantic sweep, but because he'd been kind to her when kindness was rare. Because he'd offered her a partnership based on mutual respect rather than ownership. That she'd loved him deeply but not blindly, had known his flaws and loved him anyway, and that his death had broken something in her that was only now starting to heal. On the third night, they made camp beside a river that ran silver in the moonlight. They'd finished their supper and were sitting by the fire, listening to the water and the night sounds of the forest, when Gideon finally said what had been hovering between them for weeks. I'm falling in love with you, Mara. The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. Mara's first instinct was to deflect, to make a joke, or change the subject, or pretend she hadn't heard. But she'd spent too long being dishonest with herself about her own feelings. I know, she said quietly. I've known for a while. And? Gideon's voice was careful, guarded. How do you feel about that? Mara looked at him across the fire. This man who'd come into her life bleeding and broken and had somehow become essential to it. Terrified, she admitted, because I'm falling in love with you too, and I don't know if I'm ready for what that means. What does it mean? It means trusting someone again, opening myself up to the possibility of loss. It means my children seeing me with someone who isn't their father and wondering if that makes me disloyal to David's memory. Mara's voice cracked. It means being vulnerable in ways I swore I'd never be vulnerable again. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and crossed to her side of the fire, settling beside her with careful distance between them. I can't promise you won't lose me, he said. Life doesn't work that way, but I can promise that as long as I'm here, as long as I'm breathing, I will stand beside you. I will carry what you can't carry. I will fight for you and for those children like they're my own. He took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against hers. And I will never, ever make you feel like loving me means betraying David's memory. He was your husband, the father of your children, and he deserves to be honored. I'm not trying to replace him. I'm just asking for the chance to be something new in your life. Something good." Mara looked down at their joined hands and felt the last of her resistance crumble. This was what she wanted. Not to forget David or stop loving him, but to make room for someone else alongside that love. To let herself be happy again. "All right," she whispered. "All right, Gideon. Let's see where this goes." He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face, and lifted her hand to his lips. "Thank you," he said against her knuckles, "for taking a chance on a broken-down fugitive with nothing to offer but a checkered past and calloused hands." "Your hands are perfect," Mara said. "And you're not broken. You're healing. We both are." They sat together by the fire until it burned down to embers, talking and not talking, just being in each other's presence. And when they finally rolled out their bedrolls for the night, Mara felt lighter than she had in years. Helena was bigger and noisier than Mara remembered, full of new construction and the kind of bustling energy that came with a territory on the verge of statehood. The governor's mansion sat on a hill overlooking the town, an imposing structure of stone and timber that made Mara feel suddenly aware of how worn her traveling clothes were, how rough her hands had gotten from farm work. But the governor, a silver-haired man named Edmund Crawford, greeted them both with genuine warmth. He shook Gideon's hand and then Mara's, looking her directly in the eye as he did. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, I've heard a great deal about your courage. What you did, standing up to Voss, retrieving those documents, protecting a man you barely knew, that took remarkable bravery." "I did what anyone would do," Mara said. "No, ma'am, you didn't. You did what someone with principles and backbone does. And this territory needs more people like you." Crawford gestured them to seats in his study, where a fire crackled cheerfully. "Now then, Mr. Haley, I've invited you here today to formally clear your name and offer the apology our government should have offered 12 years ago. You were wronged, sir, grievously wronged. And while I can't give you back the years you lost, I can at least ensure that the record shows the truth." What followed was a carefully orchestrated event that made Mara slightly uncomfortable, but that she could see meant the world to Gideon. There were official documents signed and sealed, a public ceremony where the governor read a statement exonerating Gideon of all charges and praising his courage in exposing corruption. There were newspaper reporters who scribbled furiously in their notebooks, and photographers who made them stand still for long exposures that left spots in Mara's vision. And there was Marcus Webb, standing at the back of the room in his dress uniform, watching his friend finally get the justice he deserved. But the moment that mattered most came later, after the ceremony was over and the crowds had dispersed. Crawford called Gideon and Mara back into his private study and handed Gideon an envelope. "Open it," Crawford said. Inside was a bank draft for a sum that made Mara's eyes widen, more money than she'd seen in her entire life. "What is this?" Gideon asked, his voice strained. "Compensation. Not from the government. We don't have that kind of budget, and besides, no amount of money can truly compensate for what was done to you.